Hello everyone, it's me, Gabby. It's been a while since my last video, but I decided, you know what? I just want to talk a little bit, ramble on a little bit about Dragon Ball Daima. Because I realize I haven't really spoken about it at all on YouTube on this channel, so I thought I might as well just talk about it a bit while the memory is still kind of fresh in my mind. The reason why I haven't really said anything about Dragon Ball Daima isn't because, I don't like it or I don't think I'm going to like it or anything like that. It's more just that I legitimately had absolutely no idea what to expect. Maybe part of that was because they weren't giving out that much information, and also part of it I think is just I have an idea of what kind of story this might be, but there is a very big difference between an idea of a pitch of a story that's in your head and what an actual show is. So it was really hard to have any sort of concrete thoughts about what it was going to be like, what I wanted to see, what I was looking forward to, etc., etc. And honestly, even after the first two episodes have aired, I'm still kind of feeling the same way. I think the first two episodes of Dragon Ball Daima have had some, nice animation, nice voice acting, some interesting lore drops here and there. But at the end of the day, when I was watching them, I kind of felt like I was watching essentially the first 30 minutes to an hour of every modern Dragon Ball movie from Battle of Gods onwards, where a lot of it is very front loaded with exposition, explaining what the plot is, explaining who the characters are, which characters are going to be important, and why they can't just use the Dragon Balls to undo the plot before it actually happens, and it has to actually lead to what's going to happen in Dragon Ball Daima in this case. Or, I guess, in a slightly less eloquent way, what I'm trying to say is the first two episodes of Dragon Ball Daima felt like it took a very long time to actually get to the point of the show and the point of the adventure and all that. The fact is, it's episode two and they're only just going to the demon world now, so the adventure hasn't even really properly started yet. Maybe for some people that sounds like kind of a harsh criticism, and maybe the pacing isn't really that bad, it doesn't really deserve it, and maybe it does need all of that exposition to really explain everything that's going on. But personally, I think there are other ways to do this sort of thing. Just because other Dragon Ball movies have been financially and commercially successful, even though they've opened up on a lot of exposition and characters just talking about, the intricacies of Dragon Ball lore, just because people like those movies doesn't necessarily mean they want to see that kind of pacing again for every future Dragon Ball thing in existence. It's probably more just a side effect of the writing process for these kinds of things between Toriyama and other people and Akio Iyoku and who even knows. Maybe that's just sort of how it ends up happening, but I do have to point it out because it is quite noticeable, especially in Daima episode 1. The most egregious example, of course, being the 10-minute long opening flashback sequence slash recap of the Majin Buu arc sequence that opens Dragon Ball Daima. I did not know what to expect when the series started, so having the audacity to open on 10 minutes of just recapping a previous arc in Dragon Ball Z is, I guess, at the very least, I admire the audacity of them for doing it, but I don't think it really needed to be that long at all. It's probably also what reminded me of other Dragon Ball movies, especially Superhero, given that a lot of the reanimated scenes kind of reminded me of the visual style used in the 2D sections in the beginning of Superhero as well. It's probably the same animation director. I haven't watched AJ's videos yet, so I can't confirm that with you. But just because I love Superhero doesn't mean I want every Dragon Ball thing to do exactly the same thing Superhero does. And of course, it doesn't actually do that anyway, so. That being said, it is pretty interesting that Dragon Ball Daima essentially started off with the two new characters, Goma and Degasu, basically doing a reaction video to the Buu arc. If you really think about it, it's just them watching Dragon Ball Z reanimated and reacting to all the events that happen, which on the one hand is kind of hilarious. On the other hand, definitely was dragged out a bit longer than it really needed to. Half of those scenes basically had nothing to do with their reactions at all. They didn't really provide any new information for them, kind of just felt like they were there because the animators just really wanted to draw this scene again. Just please bear with us. And, you know what? Fair enough. They're the ones making this show. They're allowed to draw whatever they want. But it is that thing where it's kind of clear that the fan service is kind of taking priority over the pacing and the things making logical sense. Also, a random personal thought for me while I was watching the episode is that the voice actor for Degasu, Junya Inoki, I knew beforehand that he plays Yuji Itadori in Jujutsu Kaisen. And then at one point when I started to hear that, I basically could not unhear it. And then it basically just felt like it was Yuji reacting to watching Dragon Ball Z. And at that point, my head basically said, on the one hand, that's hilarious. On the other hand, I actually wish that they were being more comical about reacting to Dragon Ball Z. After all, reacting to Dragon Ball Z is my thing, and I can say there are definitely a lot more interesting things you can talk about. Especially the Boo arc. I think one of my very personal gripe disappointments of it is the fact that they talk about the Boo arc, they watch the Boo arc, but they don't really show any of the wild shit that happens in the Boo arc. The Boo arc is absolutely insane, and they don't really show any of the insane parts. They just show the basic cool fight parts. Like, where's the part where Gotenks is taking so long to think about his ultimate move, and then Piccolo, like, points at Majin Buu and he's just drinking a sundae because he's waiting for too long? Or where they scream so hard they somehow open up a portal to another dimension without even realizing it? Or that time where Majin Buu turns Vegito into a candy, and then somehow, inexplicably, he's retained all his strength even as a candy, and Majin Buu's like, okay, actually this is too difficult, and turns him back to normal. Like, where's the reaction to those parts? Because those would be funny to react to, not like, oh look, Goku and Vegeta are fighting and they're flying. That's so crazy. And now that we've got some of the other stuff about the episodes out of the way, I just wanted to mention the thing that I've been thinking about the entire time. You know, like I said, these subjective complaints, criticisms, thoughts that are clearly maybe only I care about, but I care about it and it's my channel, so it's time to talk about it. What the hell is going on with Gohan? Listen, I'm not saying that Gohan needs to be in every Dragon Ball series, or that, like, that makes every Dragon Ball series better. But the way that they omitted Gohan from Dragon Ball Daima is honestly very weird, and a treatment I really don't see any other character getting. Because it's one thing if they just sort of sidelined him because he's not relevant or he's not popular or they just didn't want to write him, but they aren't even showing him. He basically doesn't even exist in the world of Dragon Ball Daima. He gets mentions, he's in flashbacks, but they had to specifically come up with a reason as to why he wasn't there in the big birthday party scene where the entire cast is gathered together for reasons I actually legitimately have no idea why. Because if they just didn't want to write Gohan into a series, then you just put him there. You can just have him there for a few seconds, show him have a child form like everybody else, and then it's like he's just can't fit in the spaceship. Bam, it's done. He's busy studying. Bam, it's done. But the fact they don't even show him is just such a weird it's just such a weird choice. It's somewhat consistent with how they sometimes write Gohan in recent Dragon Ball material, where they just kind of say, he's off studying, but it is just such a weird, inexplicable choice to just not include the one character when you're going to include Oolong or Puar or the Ox King or Muten Roshi. But Gohan, even though he has more significance than some of those other characters, he can't even be seen on screen for reasons, and I don't know why. It is so strange. I think there's a few potential reasons as to why Gohan is always written like this. The first is maybe just that Toriyama just does not write Gohan in the script, and they can't really do anything about that because the script as it is just doesn't really have any room for him, so they have to write him out as soon as possible so they don't have to keep mentioning him all the time. The other reason is potentially that maybe Gohan would kind of screw up a bit of the, I guess, power scaling because it is immediately after Majin Buu, and Gohan is technically stronger than Goku and Vegeta at this point, and I guess that would sort of ruin the idea, although he's going to be a kid anyway, so I don't know why that would make a difference, but, like, that is a potential theory. The other potential theory, which is the stupid one, is that actually Gohan is going to be important in Daima, and they're saving him for some reason, and they're going to make it a big surprise when he comes in, which I mean, it's not entirely implausible, but I'm not getting my hopes up because, you know, I spent a long time in Dragon Ball Super sort of being like, oh, is Gohan gonna come? Is Gohan gonna come? And like it happened. Gohan came back. It took like 88 episodes. So I learned my lesson. I'm gonna be more reasonable now. But I do think from the perspective of just this being a series and them just excluding one character, technically two if you count Videl, but one character for reasons that aren't very clear, I think it is unique, and I think it is something we do at least need to mention. Speaking of the cast, one thing I also wanted to mention before the adventure really gets going and I can actually evaluate my proper feelings about how they also work together. I did want to talk about the cast of essentially who is going to be in Dragon Ball Daima because it is definitely interesting with revelations from the opening and the ending in episode 2. I initially thought it was essentially just going to be Goku, Kaioshin, and the two new characters who Glorio and the girl who I can't remember her name. I thought that essentially they were just going to be the only characters in there, and the others might have just had like some minor supporting roles. But if the opening and ending is anything to go by, it's all the main cast of Dragon Ball Daima, at least after like maybe a first arc just with those four, we're also going to get like a new spaceship with Bulma, Vegeta, Piccolo, and I think it's just them. Also some new character as well that we haven't seen before. And honestly, I'm just kind of wondering if anything, when it was just like the four, I thought it'd be all right. But if it got to like what 7 or 8, I'm wondering if the cast might actually get a little bit bloated, especially with characters like Piccolo and Vegeta. Generally, in comedic situations, they kind of often serve the same role. That is, they're the serious ones. They're the stoic ones. They're the ones where they get comedically put in situations where they don't know how to deal with it because it's funny. Kaioshin as well, really. He's often a very kind of, even though he's not as like serious and in the sort of grumpy way like Piccolo and Vegeta are, Kaioshin's also this often like sort of stoic character. He doesn't really say too much and just kind of is sort of serious and a lot of the time. So I really do wonder what the cast dynamic is going to be like because at the moment I don't see any really immediately really interesting chemistry. Like, yeah, sure, there's going to be Goku and Vegeta being rivals, but I hate that stuff. I think that's the least interesting part about Dragon Ball, so that I'm not looking forward to anyway. If it's like Bulma and Vegeta arguing or something, I mean, I think that would just be weird because, like, the whole thing is they're children now, and if they're acting like an old married couple, it almost feels like a bit of dissonance between their appearance and what's the plot is actually about, which is just a bit weird. And Piccolo, I don't know, if he's just there to provide exposition, I guess that's kind of what Piccolo does. The new characters we've only really seen a very little bit of one character, and the other one we have not actually met yet. So it's really hard to say what they're going to be like. It's just kind of hard to tell at this point how the series is going to progress, sort of what the formula is, what the gags are, how the characters bounce off of each other, because that's probably going to be the meat of Dragon Ball Daima. I mean, given that they're all going to be nerfed because they're children, I assume this is not going to be a story about a lot of really, really big and powerful battles. There might be a lot more small scale battles, but that's kind of a thing. In a small scale battle, it doesn't have to be about who has the biggest power level or whatever. Small scale Dragon Ball is definitely interesting because it is something I don't think they have really attempted to do since Dragon Ball GT, essentially. And Dragon Ball GT has its own issues with execution. And in fact, that's sort of the reason why I am still watching Dragon Ball Daima with a lot of not hesitation, but just interest in seeing how they actually make this show, what the story actually is, how you actually tell this story. Because it's one thing to come up with an idea. It's very easy to come up with an idea. Everybody can pitch an idea. Everybody can make a potential Dragon Ball story. Everybody can make an idea of a story. But actually making a story is something that's a lot more difficult in practice. It obviously requires a lot more skills, a lot more people involved, a lot more competency in just producing an entire finished product. And it also leads to a situation where you have the most interesting idea in the world, but the actual show itself isn't really competent enough to really do those ideas justice. I know, especially when it comes to Dragon Ball GT versus Dragon Ball Super debates, a phrase that comes up so often it's almost memed at is the idea that GT has good ideas but bad execution. Or maybe even Super people will say that. But the fact is, that is actually something that is important. It's very easy to say, I'm going to make a Dragon Ball story where everything is like low stakes and everybody's young and little and power levels don't matter or whatever. And it's one thing to come up with that. It's the other thing to actually make a story like that. It's another thing to also make a story like that that's actually compelling, that's interesting, that keeps your attention, that actually provides something new that you haven't seen in another series before. Basically, there's a lot that Dragon Ball Diamond needs to do to actually be an interesting story. And I know that because Dragon Ball GT tried to do the same thing and it was not very interesting. I find it quite boring. And that's kind of probably the reason as to why it eventually shifted back to more Dragon Ball Z battles, because that was something that I guess was just easier to do. So yeah, with Dragon Ball Daima, I don't really have any proper thoughts. I'm still just sort of watching with anticipation, with hesitation, with just kind of analyzing this as almost like a skeleton of how you write a story and how you write a Dragon Ball and what actually makes a Dragon Ball a good Dragon Ball, which obviously was not what I was doing when Dragon Ball Super started airing. But also, when Dragon Ball Super started airing, it was very much trying to be the continuation of the story that they started with Battle of Gods and Resurrection F. And whether or not it actually succeeded in that, that's up to you and your own subjective opinion. But there was a lot more there that we sort of knew that they could do, that people wanted to do, that they could potentially lead on from. Whereas Dragon Ball Daima, really, you could do anything, it could be anything. And that's interesting. And unfortunately, the first two episodes is not giving me such a better idea of that yet. Other than the fact it is probably still going to be written a little bit more like the Dragon Ball Super movies as opposed to GT, I guess. But I mean, that also makes sense because, Toei animation in the year 2024 is different from Toei animation in the year 1995. So, in a way, that's just natural anyway. So, yeah, I basically don't really have that many thoughts or opinions on Dragon Ball Daima right now. I'm kind of just watching it and using it as a template of how to do episodic storytelling, whether it's good storytelling or not. And maybe that's a bit weird, but like, also, there's just not much to really talk about. Like, oh, Dragon Ball wish is like three wishes or it's one wish, like that kind of stuff. That doesn't matter. It's all incidental. What's really interesting is the actual adventure. The adventure is what everything is leading up towards. And if the adventure isn't good, then no amount of lore drops in the world is going to make this more exciting to go and watch again on a repeat viewing. So, yeah, we'll see what happens, basically. I'm obviously going to keep watching, and if there's something that I need to talk about, well, I'll talk about it. And you know where that's going to be. It's on this channel. Depending on my free time, but that's neither here nor there. Dragon Ball Super came out like almost 10 years ago. It's a very long time ago. Everybody's lives have changed probably quite a bit since I did Dragon Ball Super reviews. But yeah, introspection, yada, yada, yada. I'm just rambling on at this point. I think I've kind of said pretty much what I need to say. So I'll see you next time I need to talk about something, basically. And I'll see you then.